So this morning, we're actually ripping from the headlines and from the Parsha. This week's Parsha has in it the prohibition against tattooing. We'll see the source and the discussion about that source in just a few minutes, but I just wanted to share a couple of headlines first. These were over the last couple of weeks. The first relates to attitudes towards tattooing in Japan, right? Discreetly, the young in Japan chip away at a taboo on tattoos, right? Obviously, we'll explore more the Jewish view taboo on tattoos, or the prohibition and taboo. But Ayaka Kizu, a web designer in Tokyo, stood by her office desk one recent day, peeled Band-Aids off an apple-sized portion of her right arm. A meeting with clients had ended, so she was now free to reveal what lay underneath, a tattoo of multicolored unicorn. Ms. Kizu, 28, is one of a growing number of young people who are bucking Japan's long-standing taboos against tattoos, which remain identified with organized crime, even as the Japanese mob has faded and body art has become widely popular in the West. Around 1.4 million Japanese adults have tattoos, almost double the number from 2014, according to Yoshimu Yamamoto, a cultural anthropologist at Tsuru University, who studies traditional hajichi, tattoos worn on the hands of Okinawan women. Tattoos have a long history in Japan, and they were important to women in indigenous Okinawan and Ainu communities. Their association with organized crime goes back about 400 years. They were used to brand criminals on their arms or foreheads with marks that varied by region and crime. For instance, a circle, a large X, or the Chinese character for dog. After Japan ended more than 2 centuries of isolation in 1868, the country started promoting Western-style modernization policies, among them a law banning tattoos, which were seen as barbaric. Although that ban was lifted in 1948, the stigma remained. Tattoos are also frowned upon as a violation of communal codes for how Japanese people should look, codes that can carry severe penalties for anyone who deviates from them. So in Japan, a long tradition frowning upon tattoos, as well as even a law banning them for quite some time, making a little bit of a comeback, but still having to cover up when at business meetings or in more traditional settings because of how they're going to be perceived. So that was the article from April 23rd. A week before that, there was a profile in the Times of a Jerusalem tattoo artist, source number 2. Jerusalem tattoo artist inks pilgrims, priests, and those scarred by conflict. A Jewish man who may have been drunk once asked him to tattoo kosher in Hebrew on his butt. His oldest customer was a woman of 101. Members of the U.S. Secret Service often stop by to sample his handiwork when they're in town. But during Holy Week and days leading up to it, Wasim Razuk's tattoo parlor in Jerusalem's Old City is packed with some of his most reliable customers. Easter visitors seeking an indelible reminder of their time in Jerusalem want a tattoo as a certificate of pilgrimage, Mr. Razuk said. I have tattooed Christians, Palestinians, Ethiopians, Israelis. Believe it or not, I've tattooed an Orthodox Jew with sidelocks, said Mr. Razuk, who identifies as a member of the Palestinian Christian minority. I've tattooed nuns, atheists, and bishops. Tattooing is generally considered forbidden in both Islam and Judaism. For many Jews, tattoos stir disturbing memories of the numbers etched into the arms of victims of the Holocaust. But tattooing is now wildly popular among Jewish Israeli hipsters. And Mr. Razuk said some young Palestinian Muslims now wanted tattoos as well, influenced by the Russian prison ones they have seen in movies. So tattoos making a comeback. Anecdotally, this is something that I have noticed amongst Israelis, that where there once may have been a taboo, since with regards to the Holocaust, like the article mentions, but it's coming back. And in particular, I have noticed among less observant Jews, sometimes the tattoos are their Jewish mark. met someone who was showing me that he honored his father's memory by tattooing his father's name on his wrist. Makes it very easy to call him for an aliyah because he'll never forget. All he has to do is look up and see what his name is. Well, as long as he remembers his Hebrew name, he then knows what his father's Hebrew name was. So it's when it comes to tattoos, there's certainly something cultural, there's something exotic, maybe a little bit dangerous. People are intrigued, but there's also very certain opposition, whether it be religious opposition, Judaism, Islam, whether it be cultural opposition. And so there's certainly some taboos. So we're going to try and understand the Jewish view of the prohibition against getting a tattoo, some of the exceptions, some of the urban legends as well. Just before we launch in, any reactions, questions, or comments? So, okay, like I mentioned at the very beginning, this is actually a timely Parsha discussion because in Parshas Kedoshim, source number 3, we find the word V'seret la nefesh lo sitnu b'vsarchem uchsoves ka'aka lo sitnu bachem ani Hashem. You shall not make gashes in your flesh for the dead. That was one of the ways that people would mourn the passing of a loved one, by tearing at themselves, by cutting themselves. Instead, we say tear clothes. As well as do not incise any marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Right? The word ksoves ka'aka, ksovet has the word katav, definitely has something to do with writing. Ka'aka has to do with coloring. So these types of colored markings, don't put them in you. I am the Lord. And so how do we understand what is the nature of this prohibition? Is this just like drawing a permanent marker? But it doesn't say that. It says that bachem, it has to be inside of you. So the Mishnah in Makot, source number 4, describes the detail. One who imprints a tattoo by inserting a dye into recesses carved in the skin is also liable to receive lashes. Right, so that's the idea of a color. It's the idea of being carved into the skin. It has to be cut in. It's an offense, and you'll receive lashes for it. If one imprinted on the skin with a dye, but did not carve the skin, or if one carved the skin but did not imprint the tattoo by adding a dye, he is not liable. He is not liable until he imprints and carves the skin. So a full violation of this tattoo prohibition involves cutting and coloring. Now, important to point out, when we say he is not liable, the word in the Mishnah is patur. He is not liable means there's no lashes, there's no actionable punishment, but it still can mean prohibited. But we're now talking about what is the actionable full prohibition of tattooing violated: imprints and carves in the skin. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, he is liable only if he writes the name there, the name of God, as it is stated in a tattoo inscription, you shall not place upon you, I am the Lord. The idea that Rabbi Yeshua's understanding is that since it says I am the Lord at the end of the pasuk, it's referring to specifically tattooing the name of the Lord as a tattoo, and that's the only thing that is prohibited. So we have, the Mishnah describing what we are familiar with in terms of tattooing. There's a needle and there's ink and there's a violation. There is that more permissive view of Rabbi Yehoshua, which is not followed, but it is there, because if we're going to start talking about how the prohibition is understood, it's so important to also look at the differing views. But basically, actionable when you mark into the skin, when you cut into the skin and you leave behind some type of remnant, something that is colored, something that is there. Now, one of the questions that will emerge, and it will emerge because it's not only with regards to tattoos, is how long? Let's say it will last for a few years, but not forever. So Rashi on our verse, source number 5, says, with this idea of not, writing something engraved or dug into and sunk into the flesh, which can never be erased because it is pricked in with a needle and remains black forever. Keyword being forever. And this is going to be something that we have to discuss, because what happens if you have certain things that are, that are tattoos that are not forever? They're semi-permanent, or they last a year or 2 years or a long time, but not forever. And it will also be relevant because there are certain types of processes which involve needling and coloring and leaving behind this type of a mark that are not forever and that are not tattoos. Can anyone think of one? Thinking of something that a person may want to have on them that could involve some of this carving, making a mark, as well as coloring, but maybe it would be forever, but it wouldn't be for a tattoo, or maybe for a long period.
Henna. What about henna?
Right. So henna's so along the lines of henna's really, the way it's generally done, doesn't last as long. But there are certain types of cosmetics that do last.
Permanent makeup. Some women put
correct.
on permanent makeup so they don't know Shabbos makeup. But there's also medical tattoos that are
correct. You got both of them, Phyllis. On the one hand, there are permanent cosmetics. It's not really for Shabbos. Well, it could be for Shabbos, but it could be but it's not necessarily for Shabbos. It could also be, it makes it easier. You don't have to put on your face all the time. You just always have it. So I think that there is something, this idea of makeup. It's not forever makeup, but it lasts a long time. And there's also something called microblading with regards to eyebrows. And that's also involves digging in and leaving behind the color. And there are also sometimes skin grafts. There are certain types of coloring of the skin that can be done to cover scar tissue. These are type of medical procedures. Look, even sometimes when they're doing a surgery, they have to put a mark so they know where the surgery is going to take place. And sometimes that is of a tattoo nature. So there are certain, there are going to be certain exceptions we're going to flesh out, but in some of them, if it's not forever, like Rashi says, then maybe we'll be okay. Another type of, another modification that has to go into the discussion, source number 6, Rav Malkia says, that Rav Ada Barava says it's prohibited for a person to place burnt ashes on his wound to promote healing because it looks like a tattoo. Right? We're now worried about even if it looks like a tattoo. Rav Ashi says that any place where there's a wound, his wound proves about itself that the person's intent when he covers it with ashes is to promote healing, and this is not a tattoo. So maybe the intent is relevant, as well as whether there's a medical purpose, whether that's relevant as well. When it comes to the actual violation of prohibition, source number 7, Sefer HaChinuch, and the mitzvah not to tattoo is practiced in every place and at all times by males and females, and one who transgresses it and writes even one letter on any place of his body in the manner that we have said, that he be inscribed and generate an impression with one of the colors that make an impression, is lashed. But if others made an impression upon him, he is not lashed unless he assists. Due to the well-known principle, we do not administer lashes for negative commandment that does not have an act involved with it. So the Sefer HaChinuch introduces an idea that really the problem is the tattoo artist more than the person. But some point out that the Sefer HaChinuch notes that when is the prohibition, when is it violated, writes even one letter. Well, what if you don't write a letter? Let's say you have a tattoo of a picture. And so there's some who point out that if you talk about some of the exceptions to the rule, maybe there's no prohibition to have an image tattoo. Maybe there's no prohibition to have a tattoo if it's not going to last forever. Maybe if there's another purpose for the tattoo, a medical reason, it would be okay. So there's certain, if we can thread the needle a little bit in different directions that that may be exceptions. The Ravad in source number 8, it's there in a copy of the source. He actually says at the end of line 1 into the second line of the source, Velo ba'inan ksivas osios. You don't have to write letters. He argues with the chinuch. Elo roshem sheyasa shahu nikra ksovas kaka. Any image is a tattoo. So we have a more prohibiting view. Tosefta, source number 9. He says the prohibition is only idolatrous in nature. If we go back to the original source, the pasuk that we learned, the problem was we don't want to engage in these Gentile / idolatrous processes. And so the problem is for that, if it's not for idolatry, then maybe it's not a prohibition. So you have a verse which states no tattoos. You have a Mishnah. You have a definition of a tattoo, which is carving and leaving behind a color. And then the question is it forever? If it's not forever, is it okay? If it's not writing, is it okay? If it's for medicine, it is okay. Or there's a way to just say no tattoos, and there's a way to say there may be certain exceptions. And the general trend towards understanding this, especially because of the way that the verse is constructed, the prohibition is constructed in the verse and understood, is usually to take a very restrictive view of tattooing. It says, don't cut your skin, don't make a tattoo. I am the Lord. Almost as if that declaration at the end, not the way the opinion in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yeshua said about having a God tattoo. No, I am Hashem. It's very important that you stay far away from these idolatrous, non-Jewish rituals that exist, and don't touch the skin. No cuts, no marks, no anything. That's considered something holy. That's considered something ideal. Anything less is un-Jewish. And I think that type of sentiment is why there has always been such opposition to anything relating to tattoos, including, the idea that exists of not being buried in a Jewish cemetery with a tattoo. And we'll see some of the possible ways that practice, that myth developed shortly. Any questions or comments on the sources we see before going a little bit more to some contemporary analysis?
Rabbi, can they be removed?
So I think the short answer is sure, tattoos can be removed, because the removal of a tattoo does not involve any problematic prohibition. An interesting question that has been raised is that some people, when they get their tattoo, do put God's name as their tattoo. And so what about erasing a God's name tattoo? And generally speaking, it's approached in two ways. One, it's not really God's name if it's written on skin. That's not one of the ways that we don't protect God's name to that extent. And on some level, you shouldn't have it. So if you shouldn't have it, there's a way to get rid of it. It might not be a bad thing to do. So erasing a tattoo it's not required. And some people, especially if they made mistakes and had it and trying to cover those up, removal is something that would be certainly appropriate. Now there's an interesting discussion. We'll start veering into it. This idea of elective, what kind of procedure is it? Like, there's a whole discussion in Jewish law about elective surgery, cosmetic surgery that's elective, in terms of the idea we're not supposed to take unnecessary risks or unnecessary injuries. But for the most part, I would say when people ask, can I remove the tattoo I got that I don't want to have from a religious perspective, the answer is yes. So we raised before this idea that there are medical tattoos and medical procedures that would seem to involve the tattoo process of cutting and leaving behind color or markings, as well as some of these cosmetic procedures, which do this similarly, but also may not be permanent, but this may still last a long time. So both of these issues have been asked to different rabbis, and for the most part, there's really a bit of there's a negative response. Source number 10, and this was from the 90s. This question. This is Rabbi Nassan Gestetner. Nishalti. I was asked. Kind of a permanent makeup or 3-year lasting makeup. Or you stick into the skin a needle, and you put in some color underneath it. Is this a violation of the prohibition against tattooing? So he goes through a long discussion, and he says, since you're going to be able to tell that there's colorization, artificial colorization that came about through a needle and it lasts for 3 years, Vadai shehu begeder liolam v'asur. It's 3 years is a lifetime, right? Some people can think, sometimes a long flight can last a lifetime. But here he says a 3-year noticeable makeup inserted by way of needle under the skin is considered forever makeup, and it is forbidden because of the prohibition against tattooing. And he went through the discussion of them in the full response. He goes through the sources that we saw. The Torah says it's prohibited. Rashi says it has to be forever. Others disagree with Rashi. Some say it's only if it's for idolatry, right? That was the source number 9. But for the most part, that's not the source that's most widely accepted. Some, what about, does this rise to the level of a medical procedure, a necessary process? I guess he doesn't think so. It depends. Maybe, we have to ask what his wife thinks about the subject. But for the most part, he has a very narrow view of tattooing. If you stick a needle in, put in color, lasts for a couple of years, even if not forever, that is a violation. So Rabbi Chaim Jachter is a rabbi and educator in New Jersey. He's written a number of books on contemporary Jewish law, and he presents one of the permissive views in source number 11. Rabbi Avigdor Nebenzal, who is the rabbi of the Old City of Jerusalem, believes that even the strict opinion among the Rishonim prohibits only imprinting a picture or figure, such as an anchor or a heart. Imprinting amorphous color, he asserts, does not qualify as writing and thus does not constitute ketovet kaka. Remember, we said that there were some views that it has to be a letter, but that was the chinuch view in source number 7, and that was rejected. And so, some would say as long as you don't have a tattoo of anything besides, if it's not words, it's not a prohibited tattoo. For the most part, Jewish law recognizes any tattoo, any image as a tattoo. But Rabbi Nebenzal says just some color is not a tattoo. Accordingly, Rabbi Nebenzal is inclined to permit semi-permanent cosmetics based on a combination of 2 lenient factors: the absence of any writing and the impermanence of the markings. So he disagrees with source number 10, Rabbi Gestetner. 3 years is not a lifetime. And he has a more modest view when it comes to what is a tattoo, right? If you talk about the levels, one would say the strictest view is any colorization is a tattoo. Another would say any image is a tattoo, and one would say any letter is a tattoo. So the Rabbi Gestetner took the strictest view, and Rabbi Nebenzal is a little bit more of a lenient view. He's not going to say you can tattoo images, but you can just have some colorization. Accordingly, Rabbi Nebenzal is inclined to permit semi-permanent cosmetics based on a combination of 2 lenient factors: the absence of any writing and the impermanence of the markings. Both Rav Basri and Rav Schneelbach are inclined to permit cosmetic tattooing in a case of kavod habriot. Kavod habriot means the dignity of people. For example, Rav Basri permits surgeons to tattoo eyebrows onto the forehead of a woman who has no eyebrows. Rav Schneelbach is inclined to permit cosmetic tattooing, even in more common situations, scar removal. In this procedure, a pigment that matches the color of human skin is injected beneath the scar, allowing that area to appear like the rest of the person's skin. Although it seems to qualify as ketovet kaka, Rav Schneelbach permits it due to kavod habriot. And so here, we were introduced to another leniency with regards to the dignity of people, how they'll feel about it. People's appearances can be very much an issue on their minds, and therefore something that they want to correct, or certain issues that are there medically or the like. And for where to protect kavod habriot, there are certain permissive rulings by these rabbis who would otherwise be strict, but for kavod habriot, for dignity for the person to do these procedures. Remember, these are not outright tattoos. They're not letters. They're not even images. It's colorization. So it seems that especially it does not necessarily seem to be a huge jump from the sources for this to be the case, because we saw many mitigating sources with regards to tattoos. A tattoo may only be God's name. A tattoo may only be words. A tattoo has to actually be forever. And even though as Rabbi Jachter notes at the end of the source, the consensus of contemporary poskim forbids permanent and semi-permanent makeup, even though for the most part there's a more restrictive view taken towards any activities of needles beneath the skin leaving colorization. The sources would seem to back up the more permissive views, certainly if you add the human dignity variable into the equation. Questions, comments, reactions? Okay, so I wanted to spend just a few minutes, at the end, talking a little bit about, the visceral distaste bordering on disgust for tattoos, and certainly the Holocaust may have reinforced that distaste, but it seems to seep into the Jewish consciousness. Wanted to show something. I'm just gonna get a hold of it now and put it onto the screen. See if I can do this. We'll see how we'll see if I'm able to do this now. I might not be able to. I'm not sure I can do this from here. Let's see. No, all right. In the sources you'll be able to look at on your own, there's a link to a episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, season 3, episode 6, right? That's Larry David show. And the description is there in source number 12. Larry works in New York and returns to learn that his mother died and was buried in an area for criminals because she has a tattoo. He plots to get his mother moved out of the special section. And he uses the laws to decline unwanted invites. So basically he finds out that his mother was buried in the area for criminals, and the the cemetery director explains it's because she has a tattoo, and it's prohibited to bury people with tattoos in the regular section. So she has to go to the section of the special section where everyone else gets buried. And so, as we have mentioned before, certain elements of Jewish culture have have taken on a life of their own. And in particular, this one. And so I encourage you to watch the clip at your convenience. And the idea that it's almost taken as a given that people can't be Jewish, people can't be buried in a regular Jewish cemetery if they have tattoos. The question is, where did that come from? Where did the idea emerge? And so, the funeral director in the episode says it's based on the verse, but the verse just says you can't get a tattoo. Doesn't say anything about what happens if you get a tattoo, if there being any repercussions. And in fact, source number 13 from an article already almost 14 years ago, discussing this issue. For some Jews, it only sounds like a taboo. 8 rabbinical scholars interviewed for this article from institutions like the Jewish Theological Seminary and Yeshiva University said it's an urban legend. Most likely started because a specific cemetery had a policy against tattoos. Jewish parents and grandparents picked up on it, and over time their distaste for tattoos was presented as scriptural doctrine. So the idea of the idea of a tattoo is clearly a prohibition, but there are plenty of prohibitions that some Jews don't observe. There are plenty of non-observant Jews, and you'll have plenty of Jews who, if you're ranking the importance of some of the rules of Judaism, you'll have people who won't necessarily observe Shabbos or kosher, but will be very careful not to get a tattoo because you can't get buried in a Jewish cemetery. And it's it's kind of like you're able to turn your distaste for a tattoo into a prohibition, which is a prohibition, but a prohibition that is followed more than other prohibitions. Sometimes when you talk about the rituals of Judaism, have an opportunity to inculcate a certain amount of discipline into Jews. Right, Shabbos. Someone who observes Shabbos won't be on their phone over Shabbos, even though they're addicted to their phone the rest of the week. Kosher, right? You're very, very hungry, but the food's not kosher. You're not going to eat it unless you're about to die. When it comes to, it's kind of interesting that the same logic has been applied to tattoos, but not for the right reason, right? Don't get a tattoo because you can't get by a Jewish burial. Okay, so while you are, lighting the candle on Shabbos, eating a ham sandwich, you're not going to get a tattoo because of the repercussions. It's a very interesting emotional way that this plays out in the religious consciousness of the less observant Jew. But it seems that it emerges from really at times our definitely being very much attuned and connected to anything relating to death, right? Very often, even people don't necessarily live fully connected to Jewish practice, that when they pass, whether their wishes are for things to go well or they feel that it's important for things to be done in accordance with the Jewish tradition, and which is interesting because many of the rules and regulations of a traditional Jewish end of life, funeral, burial, shiva, are all customs, not laws, and so that I think extends into this issue here also. You may not be as careful about living Jewishly the whole life, except not to get a tattoo, so that when you die, you can get buried the right way. But even though it's based on a myth, and there probably is truth to, it's almost how new practices get started. There was likely a burial society or a cemetery that would not handle a body with a tattoo. And all of a sudden that became the new practice, no tattoos. So it kind of highlights how mistaken processes can be born. Kind of reminds me of the story they tell about a Hanukkah practice, that the Hasidim went to the Rebbe's house to watch him light the Hanukkah candles. On the 4th night of Hanukkah, before lighting the candles, the Rebbe was about to light, but before he lit, he took a broom and he swept the area in front of the menorah. And the Hasidim were enthralled, sweeping. What does that represent? Sweeping away the Yetzer Hara, sweeping away the darkness. Well, and so everyone starts sweeping in front of the menorah. And they asked the Rebbe why he swept, and he said because it was dirty.
Right.
So it's there's something. The Jewish soul, the Jewish consciousness is on the lookout for practices which for practices which maybe can be easily incorporated or come from places which we feel are important, even if they're not. And so here, not getting a tattoo is a real prohibition. However, the avoidance of it comes from a place, from a very different on-ramp. And it's the fear of properly being, the way one's body is treated at the end of one's life, which seems to be the motivation to avoid doing something while not caring about any of the other rules and regulations. Just want to point out briefly, Rabbi Jachter in his article, talks a little bit more about how why such a negative approach. Even that we saw some of the rabbis are very only really reluctantly approving things which don't seem to be that prohibited. Right, we saw some mitigating sources, but we still see the more restrictive approach taken by the halachic decisors, even even being less willing to permit medical situations or cosmetic situations where where it doesn't seem to have to be so. You don't have to search so hard to find the opportunities for it. He thinks that there's something about the way the verse is written that don't do this. I am Hashem. That there's a certain religious value in not changing appearances. The idea that we say similar to the way that we treat the body with respect because it was the repository of the soul. Similarly, that we're not allowed to do anything to our bodies because we're not in charge of it. There's a certain humility or submission to the divine that's involved in doing nothing alien or foreign to our bodies during our lifetimes, and that this was the thrust of the religious approach that dominated the discussion when it comes to tattoos, and which led to such little mitigation, even though the sources are there to seem to be a little bit more permissive. Yes, Elliot.
Just a quick question with reference to Larry David and the burial in a place where his mother would be. Does it make a difference who's next to you when you're buried?
So it's a good question. You have to watch the clip, and you'll see that they talk about the special section is for sinners, for people who commit suicide.
I understand.
And the like. So there is an idea of being buried surrounded by good neighbors. Right, people who live their lives similarly. That's why certain burial societies have various criteria for being able to be buried in that plot, so that you're buried in the right way. Look, in general, we know Jews are buried in Jewish cemeteries, and those are set aside and separate from non-Jewish cemeteries. And then, I would say for the most part, other criteria are sometimes are papered over. So for the most part, we don't usually talk about, unless you're with your own family or small groupings, about you're not worried so much what level of kosher or shabbos the person being buried near you is keeping. Although some would say good fences make good neighbors, so cemetery plots have something similar. But they do talk about, for example, heretics. They talk about people committing suicide, being buried away from the populace. Interestingly enough, usually with the determination made with regards to suicide is that we assume that someone who commits suicide regrets that decision, and that so we don't look at it as being a willful decision. We look at it as being coerced by mental illness or something on the outside. I actually just read an article yesterday. They're talking about Yom Ha'atzmaut. So there's an article about Herzl. So suffice to say, Herzl had no nachas from children. Right? Herzl had 3 children. Two of them committed suicide. One was in a mental institution, killed by the Nazis. There was one grandchild who committed suicide. Actually, I think it was 1947 in Washington, D.C. I'm mentioning this because when they the state of Israel brought Herzl to be reinterred in Har Herzl, and there was a discussion about reinterring his family members, and there was a lot of pushback because his son became a Christian, and they wanted to say, why should you reinter in a Jewish cemetery someone who became a Christian? And the same thing with his grandson who committed suicide. There was pushback from some religious quarters about why should we bury in the Jewish cemetery someone who shouldn't be in the Jewish cemetery? And chief rabbi at the time was Rabbi Amar, who said that we shouldn't look at it as someone who flagrantly is committing suicide, someone who is Mara Shchora, evil forces, spirits. He was mentally ill, coerced, and ultimately all the family members, those who committed suicide, those who converted out, were reinterred. His daughter, who was killed in the concentration camp, obviously was not, because they don't have remains. But so with regards to your question, it's out there. We generally, we don't really set communal policy for such matters. Usually individuals can decide, or if they're setting up their own graves or cemeteries is one thing, but usually we don't pry too much with regards to the neighbors.
When I went to yeshiva, we were taught that you wouldn't mark up a Torah because it's a holy item. You wouldn't mark up your body because that is also a holy item.
Right. And so I think that there's a certain there's a certain kiddusha. Remember, the parsha that this is found in this parsha Kedoshim, that these are things that are holy. And so if you can't tattoo, we don't want to go there at all, even if sometimes there might be a reason to do so. But correct.
I just wonder, Rabbi, if that, God forbid, that person that went through the concentration camp that has a number tattooed on them, they go right to Olam Haba?
Well, Kedoshim, certainly. I think that we also remember, you're not responsible for something done to you. So if you're asking from a purely legal perspective, it's not a violation. But I think that, look, that mark, for many, it is, that markup, that tattoo is reason to avoid tattoos. Others are, kind of inverting it to, it's to be inked as a Jew is something that they want to hold on to. And certainly, as we debunked the myth of not being able to be buried in the cemetery, because of it, it certainly opens the floodgates.
Well, like a vote, Rabbi. Nice topic.
Yeah.